Fred has made it a lifetime effort to trace and document his and his family and other survivors' histories before, during, and after the Shoah, and published a memoir documenting their experiences, and he'll share those events in his talk entitled Flight and Survival, Finding Safe Havens.
Thank you, Rabbi. Can you see the million names and souls that are being lit up by each one of these candles? So it was a little hard to decide what to call this talk. And I picked Flight and Survival because that was really what those who were trapped in the Shoah were trying to do. And for those who made it, trying to find a safe place where they could live and find a home again, that was really their objective more than anything else. I'll start by a little bit of an introduction. So my wife and I are new members of Temple Amunah. We're grateful to be here. This is really the kind of place where we wanted to be all of our lives. The rabbi gave you some of our credentials. My wife and I both met at the University of Chicago. We got our doctorates at Purdue University. And we've been in Massachusetts for a year. We're new to here. We lived 15 years in New Hampshire and came down to be close to our family here. We lived 12 years in Philadelphia and 16 years in Illinois. So we moved around a lot. Besides that, I grew up in Indiana. So in that sense, I'm a Hoosier. But I was born in Baku, Azerbaijan during World War II. And whenever we meet someone new and they ask us, where are you from? And my wife says, well, I'm a Chicago girl. I was born in Chicago. And they ask me, where are you from? And I say, well, I'm a Hoosier. I grew up in Indiana. But I was born in Baku. Then all kinds of questions come out. I'm a Holocaust survivor. I'll tell you about my family story. And I'm proud to be an American citizen. So here is where I grew up. I grew up a little bit outside of Chicago in South Bend, Indiana, home of Notre Dame. But I was born on the other side of the world in Baku, in Azerbaijan. Nearby, Iran on one side, on Armenia, Georgia, and off of the Caspian Sea. So from here to here, oops, sorry. I want to start with this. So I started over here. I don't know why this is doing it. I'm sorry. So I started on the other side of the world. One more. And never expected that I'd be on the other side of the planet in the United States. But my history begins with my parents' history, as always. And my father's name was Mendel, as you've heard from time to time when I come to the Torah. My mother's name was Frida, and they were born in Poland, and their families and generations of their families had lived there for a long time. Their parents and families lived in a small town, kind of a shtetl, by the name of Sokola Podlaski, east of Warsaw. And in 1939, the two of them were sweethearts. I talked about getting married and settling down, and then everything changed. And on September 1st, 1939, as all of you probably know, Hitler attacked Poland, and Poland was overrun, and very early on, this little town was bombed. There were many deaths, and it didn't take long before the German army was in the town and occupied it, and brutalization of Jews started, and my mother was attacked. And she decided that she couldn't remain there anymore. And said to my father, as soon as chance I get, I'm going to leave. I'd like you to come with me, but if you can't go with, I'm going to leave anyway. And on September 28th, some of them were able to leave and go farther, and this is what their path was. By that time, Europe was under massive attack. The Russians and the Germans had split Poland apart. Germany was supposed to occupy the west part of Poland, and Russia was supposed to occupy the east part, but there was a mistake. And the Germans were not supposed to be in their hometown, but they were there. But there was an opportunity at one point for my parents to escape from the German side into the Soviet-occupied side, and they took that. So leaving wasn't easy because my father went to his parents and said, "You need to leave because it's going to be terrible here." And they said to him, "You shouldn't go because we survived all this before. We were here during World War I when the Germans occupied, and we managed to survive. How much worse can it be than that?" And so they refused to leave. On my mother's side, her father had passed away a short time before, but she decided that she would take her mother with and her sister. Her mother's name was Chaya, and her sister's name was Velva. And, my grandmother's name was Chaya, her sister's name was Leah, and Leah had a friend, Velva, whom she married later on. They managed to escape from the town into the Russian zone, and they got married in a city nearby called Bialystok, which was at that point in the Russian zone. And as they were there, the war came closer and closer, and they were afraid that if they stayed, they would be taken back by the Germans. So they decided at that point that they would leave and go farther east, and they went by rail to a city in far eastern Russia by the name of Berezhniki. I'll share where that is. They spent 18 days in a boxcar, and Berezhniki was in the Ural Mountains, and it was awful in the wintertime. They were there for the better part of a year. So this is the path that they took. So here's Poland, here's Sokolov Podlaski, a little bit on the western side. And they went all the way out here. Here's Moscow, part of the way there, and all the way into far eastern Russia is the city of Berezhniki. So they went there from September 22nd, 1939 to January 1940. That trip was about 3,000 kilometers, a really difficult journey. While they were in Berezhniki, and I'm skipping a lot of things because there just isn't enough time for it, my father at one point was kind of a work camp for many Jews had fled from Western Europe. My father was arrested by the secret police on a trumped-up charge. I don't have time to go on that story, but if you ask me later, maybe I can do that. He was beaten, tortured, told he would never get out of jail, that he would die there. But after 3 months, they determined that he was innocent of their charges and he was let out. Before that time, my mother had her first child, Abraham, and he was born during the time that my father was able to finally get out of jail. At that time in Berezhniki, my father tried to maintain communication with his mother, who was left behind in Poland. And the last letter he got from his mother was at the end of 1940. And in that letter, he learned that there had been a ghetto formed in Sokolov, and that Jews from neighboring towns all around that region had been pushed farther and farther east, had been put into that ghetto, which was a very small place and became tremendously overpopulated with people who were on the way farther east, on the way really to Treblinka. And at that point, my father didn't know what the fate of the family was and what it was going to become, because that was the last letter he heard. After my father was released from prison, he was finally allowed to leave, and he and my mother and my mother's mother, my grandmother, were able to leave Berezhniki. And at that point, the two sisters, my mother and her sister, became separated. They didn't see each other again until the end of the war. They didn't know whether either one had survived. And as my parents were allowed to leave, left up here from Berezhniki, and they went all the way south to Crimea, which is today in the news, and the issue with the Russians is again a major one. They were there in a small city, and they thought that they could be there for a long time, but it wasn't to be. So they were in Crimea by March of 1941, another 3,000 kilometer trip. But as they were there, the war got closer and closer. Germany and Russia became lost stopped being allies. They became part of the war machine against each other. And as they were in Crimea, they started to hear the German army approaching, started to hear cannons approaching, and they came to understand that they had to leave. And at that point, there were no choices because they couldn't go farther north because the war was there, or west. The only choice they had was to go farther east. And that was the direction that they took, them and along with the baby. So this is the chronology. In March 1941, the family left Berezhniki for Crimea. And on June 22nd, Germany attacked Russia. By September, the German army reached the area where they were in Crimea. So in September, my family left Crimea through these towns, ultimately into Azerbaijan, the only direction they could take. And I think the next one is a map. So this is where they started. Again, I like maps. And the only direction they could go was this way. Here's the Black Sea. They went across, some of these were land bridges, some of them involved finding ways to cross the seas up here. And they made their way through each of these cities. Their target was to get to Baku. But Baku was a militarized city, and they weren't allowed to go there. And so they were dumped in this city farther up called Makhachkala. And part of the war, they were there. So here's that chronology. They left in September 1941. But in February 1942, in Makhachkala, my father was charged again as a spy because he didn't have papers, because in the middle of the war and transiting from one country to another, there was no way to keep papers together. So he was charged as a spy again, put in prison, and was told again that he'd never get out of jail. 3 months later, he was finally released, and when he came out, he found out that his son, Abraham, had died of diphtheria. During that time period, my mother and my grandmother had no place to go. They were going from school to school, finding benches to sleep on. And during some of that, their son, Abraham, my oldest brother, passed away. So it was a terrible time for him. During the war, my father was able finally to get toward the Baku area, and he worked throughout all of Azerbaijan, whatever he could do. My father and my mother worked in the fields. My father learned how to operate a tractor, a skill that saved him later on. But during all that time, they never knew what was happening back in what was their home and what ultimately would be their home farther on. So in December, I was born, Efraim Yitzchak. I was born near Baku. The family was in Azerbaijan from 1941 to 1944. And in May of 1945, as the Germans surrendered, as the war started coming down, the family started to find their way back. They wanted to get back and find out what happened to relatives that they left behind in Sokolov. But they weren't able to go all the way back. So they got back the same way that they reached Azerbaijan. They returned to Crimea first. This is the path they took. So if you remember, they were in Azerbaijan. Oops, sorry. I have to be careful with this clicker. So here it is. They started out in, I think it's one more back. Yeah. Started in Azerbaijan. They managed to find their way all the way back to Crimea. And by that time, the war was now over, and hundreds of trains were assembled for those who had survived the war and now try to find their way farther back. And they made their way back. Their target was to get to their town, Sokolov-Podlasky, but they couldn't get there. The train finally dumped them out at a refugee collection center in western Poland, not far from Germany. The town was called Kamienia Góra in Poland. Another trip of 1,800 kilometers. By then it was 1946. So here is a small piece from my book that I'd written about what it was like for those who were returning. It was a very long trip of almost 2,000 kilometers. As the train took them across Crimea, through Ukraine and Poland, they could see devastation and rubble everywhere. As the train passed through city after city, they were aghast at the destruction they saw. The war just stopped. They passed through Lvov, city that held as many 100,000 Jews before the war. Nazis had built a concentration camp, Yanovska, where I'd visited. where more than 200,000 were murdered. Other Jews had been sent to Belzec concentration camp farther away, where upwards of 500,000 Jews were murdered. As they passed not far from Krakow, which we visited some years ago, and other displaced Jews were picked up, they learned of the horrors of Auschwitz-Birkenau and the horrors that had been perpetrated on Jews of Europe. By the time their train arrived in the collection center, Kamienna Gora, they were shaken in a total state of shock. At that point, I was 3 or 4 years old. And my family at this point moved entirely on faith with no idea what they would do or find after they arrived there. All they knew was it was one of the places where the displaced, the homeless, the refugees from the disaster that was the Shoah were streaming. From across Europe and Western Asia they came, the remnants of what had been the Jews of Europe before the war, hidden in attics, basements, and barns, whether they masqueraded as Poles or Austrians or Germans or Slavs, masquerading as Christians or Muslims, whatever the need or opportunity, they now returned to refugee collection centers, like centers that are around the world today, to try to find out what happened to those that had been left behind, those lost, grandparents or parents, brothers, sisters, children separated in war, many of them, uncles, nieces, anyone lost now remembered that might have survived, became bewildered or savvy, no longer looking like their former selves, skeletons and injured. I'll show you some pictures. Many times separated in the humanity they'd maybe known before, now desperately looking for whom they'd lost and hopeful they could retain the now a lost life and a town and a home that might still exist. And all the time fearful of what might be lost forever, never to be regained, and all not knowing what home could still be for them and any loved ones that they still had. So Kamienna Gora, and I've heard a lot about that over the years, and at one time when I was interviewing my father, I was recording his story. I was trying to locate where this town was. I just could not find it. I went through map after map, and I finally was ready to give up. My father was of the kind of nature, he never gave up on anything, and maybe that's why he survived the war. He finally found it. It was another temporary place for them, administered by agencies such as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, or the American Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint. It was set up after the war to enable people to return, to collect information on what was left, on who was left, on where they came from, or who they could still be connected to, what could be done with them, and where they could go. These collection centers were a lifeline for those trying to recover or build a new life, and many of them are still highly active today. Mendel and my father and the rest of the family registered with the Joint, were given temporary quarters, and started to try to see how to put their life back together. All they knew now was that with all they had endured, with all they had seen on their trip back, they'd survived. They still didn't know what happened to my mother's sister and family, because they'd been separated long before, or the rest of my father's family, but they'd survived. Somehow, my mother and her sister were reunited in that place. And I don't know how much time I've got, but that's just an amazing story. So my mother's sister had survived in the town where she'd been from the beginning. And at that point, she had 2 children. My father decided he couldn't just continue to stay there and not find out what happened to his family. So he left all of us behind in Kamienna Gora and took a trip back to his hometown, Sokolov Podlasky, to try to find his mother, his brothers, and sister left behind. This was the trip. So here's Kamienna Gora. Oops, sorry. I keep hitting the wrong button. So here's Kamienna Gora. I have to find that clicker that doesn't let me do that. Right here. Went through Ruklov, which I've learned had quite a few Jews before the war. Went all the way back to his town of Sokolov Podlasky. And it was a difficult trip because Russians were very active at the time, and he had to hide the fact that he was a Jew even there. This was in 1946. So he went back to try to find out where were they, what had happened to them. What he found out was everything was lost. None had survived. Before the war, 75% of the population in Sokolopodlasky was Jewish. After the war, 36 survived, and they had left and gone elsewhere. There were no Jews left in Sokolopodlasky. My wife and I visited Poland and Sokolopodlasky. There is still the remnants of a synagogue there. There are remnants of all kinds of Jewish presence, but not a single Jew. This is what my father's family looked like before the war. This is my father as a young man. This is his mother. This is his brother. These two are his brother, and this is his little sister. And this is his older sister, Roja, who left in 1936 before the war started and ran away from home and went to Israel, started her own family. And working on my book, that's the longest chapter in my book of what happened to her and how she survived. So of them all, my father survived. All the rest of them perished. I had thought from everything that he had told me that they'd all, on the evening of Yom Kippur, been taken out of the village and brought to trains that were there that would take them to Treblinka. I found out a few years ago that one thing was wrong, that his mother had perished in the town. She never made it to Treblinka, but the rest had died. So I guess one more thing I should say is our son David has two middle names. One is for him, Moshe. The other is for him, Bishop. These are others that I've come to know that we're related to. Everyone in this picture died. None of them survived. And we know their stories as well. Part of what I've attempted to do is to try to remember the names and what happened to everybody that we had connections to. And we have a cousin who is related to the people in this picture. She's also a survivor, has given talks on it. She was born in Paris, and her story is unique. This is a special picture for me. This is a picture of a Chavurah, a youth group in Sokolopodlasky before the war. In this picture is my father and my mother as sweethearts before the war. This is my mother's girlfriend. And as far as he knew and from everything he told me, they were the only survivors from the war. What I found out a few years later was that he didn't know it, but there was one more survivor. He was a survivor. And I came to know how he survived from an email that I got a few years ago because I put all my pictures on the internet. And someone had recognized the picture. Her grandfather had this picture on his wall in South America. And he had understood that that was the only picture in existence. And I'd posted my pictures, and when she saw the picture, she contacted me and said, how did this come there? And I've been trying ever since then to contact her. She has traveled all over the world. She's now in California to get that story as well. So we were in the collection center for quite a while, and they were trying to find out what to do with all the Jews that they had there, and because going back to their hometowns in Poland just was not going to work. And so the next thing was they sent all of our family to displaced persons camps. We went to two, one in Linz and one in Wels, and we were there from 1946 to 1949. And the main mission there was, of everyone, was writing letters to try to find out what their lives could possibly be from that point. My grandmother was there as well. She had her father, who had died before the war started, had married twice. He had 12 children from the first wife. The first wife passed away. He had 12 more children from the second wife. She was from the second batch. And so she was writing. Some of those children had immigrated long before the war to the United States. And she was contacting them, brothers and sisters, to try to find out what happened and if there was a way that they could help them find a way out of that place in the United States, which is eventually what happened. That's a long story by itself. So ultimately, a brother of my grandmother came to visit them. Couldn't believe any of the stories about the war, about 6 million Jews dying. My father took them to a concentration camp that was nearby, showed them the ovens, and they believed what had happened from that point forward. They went on because their objective was to visit Israel, and this was a stopping point for them. But they went back to the United States after 1946. It took 3 years to get visas, and then we went from the displaced persons camp in Wells to Bremerhaven, and from there took a ship to go back to what would eventually potentially be a home for us. So to summarize, this is where they started. They started over here in eastern Poland, Sokolov. This was their journey up to Russia. And from there, a year later, they made their way all the way down to Crimea, and from Crimea into Azerbaijan, and ultimately to Baku, which is where I was born. And then from there, all the way back. So from Austria to the United States, besides my family, there were many other Jews that were trying to find relatives in the United States to go to. So this is from my book as well, and I'd like to read this for you. With great trepidation, we finally boarded the train that would take us through Germany, Germany of all places. We'd finally arrive in the harbor of Bremerhaven, where a ship would take us to the United States at last, to New York. From there, where would we go? We didn't know, never heard of Indiana. Hopefully we'd find a place to finally call home. It was a mixed human cargo boarding the ship, dressed in whatever they still had, whether their own or from found cast-off clothing. We boarded with very few pitiful belongings, a small suitcase, bundles of things we still hadn't given up, the last things we'd been able to save to carry us forward. There were survivors from many places, those who'd been forced into labor camps in the East, like my parents, those who'd survived while being forced to work in factories or working on farms, some pitiful few survivors of concentration camps, those who'd fled and fled farther and farther east and north, east and south, to the Ural Mountains separating Europe and Asia, to Ukraine and Crimea, to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Turkey, Georgia, to the Caucasus Mountains, to Azerbaijan. And there are books of survivors from all of these places talking about what their experiences had been. And eventually, including the survivors that made it to the displaced persons camps, now boarding their ship of hope. The ship moved up the river to the sea, and the passengers stood and silently watched the land receding from their view. This is some of my earliest memory. With Europe fading out of sight, knowing they might never again see the lands, the homes they'd come from, or the family that might still be in those areas, and hopeful that the ship would bring them to a new home ahead. This is a picture of going toward the ship to finally leave Europe and come to the United States. My father, after the war, my mother, my brother Irving, Yisroel, and me, carrying the one suitcase that we still had to carry forward. So what happened to Jewish Sokolov? Well, my parents weren't there. As I said, September 11th, 1939, Nazis marched into Sokolov, and bloody terror launched against the Jews, not just at the beginning, but continuing. On Sukkot of 1939, September 28th, the Russians entered the cities, the Nazis left briefly. By 1940, Jewish businesses were confiscated like they were in Austria and in Germany. There was forced labor, hunger, and cold, and by the end of 1940, the Jewish ghetto had formed. That was at the beginning of when my father got the last letter from his mother. By July of 1942, freight cars with thousands of Jews from surrounding areas passed on the way, stopping at Sokolov, but on the way eventually to Treblinka. My wife and I visited Treblinka. We made one trip to visit Poland together, history and genealogy, and to see what the town was like and to visit Treblinka. That was something we'll never forget. On Yom Kippur of September 21st, 1942, the Jews were forced from the ghetto where they were crowded and sent on to Treblinka. And of the 6,300 Jews that had lived in Sokolov at the beginning, there were only 36 survivors. So in growing up, I was very much involved in trying to find out all the history they could and all the pictures that my parents had been able to save. These are pictures from before the war. And what's interesting is before and after. So here is a picture of my mother and father as sweethearts before the war. I'll show you what they looked like after the war. A picture of my father and his wonderful new suit. A picture of my parents strolling the streets of Sokolov, which I got to do just a few years back. A picture of my grandmother, his mother, who hadn't survived. A picture of my father's family that I'd shown you. A picture of my mother and her sister. A picture that I call Zwei Schwesterlein, two little sisters. A picture of friends that didn't survive. And a picture of the Havara from Sokolov. Now, if you see this picture, here's what they look like at the beginning. Here are pictures after the war. So here's what they look like after the war in the displaced persons camp, and the toll that the war had taken on them. This is my brother and me. This is me and my brother and my cousins from my mother's sister on the way to displaced persons camps in a buggy. This picture isn't the first displaced persons camp we came to. There are 27 people in that room. It's a single room. That's where everybody was put. Picture I showed you, this is a picture of me during prom, all dressed up. And this is a picture of our first night in the United States. This is the Uncle Joe, a brother of my grandmother, who had gotten visas for us to enter. And from then on, stories diverged. And part of my effort was to collect the stories. So here is a phrase I got from Deuteronomy 4:9. Only guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, unless these things depart your heart all the days of your life. You shall make them known to your children and your children's children. And that's what we're doing today. Thank you for inviting me. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if there's not time, that's my email address, and I'm happy to respond to anybody that contacts me.